going on, YouTube? I hope everybody's doing well. So today we're going to talk about the journey to redemption. Christians have a pretty good story that they like to tell themselves most of the time. It's basically that you're either going into a storm, you're coming out of a storm, or you're in the middle of a storm. And that's pretty good. Because Jesus always said, in his parables that whoever heeds his teachings, is like a wise man who builds his house on a rock. And he also says that the winds and the rain will come and their house will stand. And then whoever doesn't heed his teachings is like the fool who built his house on sand. And then when the winds and the rain come, his house falls down and it leads to ruin. And, it is important to note in these parables, that Jesus does specifically state that the winds and the rain will come. So you will be in a storm. And so, that metaphor that they like to use works really well. But I find the story about the Israelites leaving Egypt, I find that a lot more useful. And so let me just acquaint you with the story. So in Genesis, at the end of Genesis, the Israelites end up in Egypt, and Joseph basically does a lot of good things for Pharaoh. And, this is obviously not Joseph, Jesus's, paternal figure, but it's actually another Joseph. And he does some things for Pharaoh and basically secures a future for the Israelites who are in Egypt at this time. But God actually said, hey, I want you in Canaan, okay? And that's about an 11-day journey, okay? If you were to walk from Egypt to the area of what would be modern-day Israel. And over 400 years they stayed there. I mean, that's how secure they were because of Joseph and, the Lord's guidance. And over time, the leadership class in Egypt changed. And what we ended up having is, the Israelites became oppressed. And they basically became a slave class. Now, they had craftsmen, and they had all the things that a community of people would have. At this time, it was estimated that they had 500,000 of them living in Egypt. And, the Lord calls Moses to deliver them from Egypt. Now, at this time, Egypt, they had a lot of modern comforts for their time, okay? But they were treated poorly, okay? They were oppressed, they were beaten, they were worked, without good conditions at all. And then at first they were given straw to make bricks, and then they had to go find their own straw, and they still had the same quotas that they had to meet. And if not, it was on penalty of death or flogging. It was pretty harsh conditions. It was slavery. And so the Lord sees what's happening to his people, and he delivers them using Moses. And they go into the wilderness, and they're wandering around. And I want you to remember that this is supposed to be an 11-day journey. They wander around for 40 years. And they're just wandering around. They're not settled anywhere. They are just wandering around. And they are wholly reliant upon God for their provision. Which eventually they get to the promised land. Okay? But all of the original people who were delivered from Egypt, they all had to die. And, that's pretty harsh. And they were not allowed to step foot into the promised land. This is to include Moses himself. Okay, he was not allowed to go into the promised land. And then once they get to the promised land, then of course, the story of Israel begins. Um, and they're able to, take over Jericho and, move forward from there. Now, again, the principal parts of this story I find are very useful are, Egypt, um, you have the wilderness, and finally you have the promised land. And I find that in our walk in life, we are in either of those places. We're either in Egypt, or we are in the wilderness, or we are in the promised land. Now, chances are, if you're at this channel and you are hurting because, again, you hurt someone you loved, you are in the wilderness. Now, let me just give you some perspective. While the Israelites were in the wilderness, they constantly lamented to Moses and to God about how, at least when they were in Egypt, they had, some proper food. I mean, God made it rain manna from heaven. And while that is amazing, it's not a steak, right? It's not, it's not fresh fruit. It's not, all these things that they were accustomed to. I mean, some of the Israelites were able to get by with a relatively decent life. And I mean, think about it. If you dedicate yourself to a to a trade, let's say you're a blacksmith, or, let's say a modern day, let's say you're an electrician and you genuinely enjoy what you do. And God calls you up out of what you're doing and says, you're not going to be an electrician anymore. And let's say you're in your mid 40s, mid 50s. And that's all you've done and you're good at it. And you are happy when you do your trade. I mean, that's going to cause you some despair. So, the Israelites are going through a tough time. I mean, they're not being fed in a way that would make them happy. Okay, they are being fed on what they need, not what they want. I mean, again, we don't necessarily need a steak. Okay, I mean, all we need is maybe some potatoes. But I mean, who wants to live off potatoes, right? Okay, so just to get this back, get this story back on the road. When we're in the wilderness, the Lord takes away. He trims on what we don't need in our life. And all the while, when we are in Egypt, we are living in a way that is really self-centered, okay? Life is always oppressive, okay? So I want you to understand that life is always coming at you, always. Life is suffering, okay? I mean, everyone you know and love will die, and you will lose every single relationship that you make. You will lose eventually. That's life. It really is. But if you look at it like that, I mean, that's going to be a really hard pill to swallow. That is going to cause you to have a very bleak outlook on life. It really will. But it does alleviate you from, from having this attitude that you can be angry, and vengeful at life because, again, you're a victim. And yes, in that extent, I guess we're all victims. But it's not useful to frame the way you look at the world like that, right? And so when you're in Egypt, you have this mentality of trying to create all these short-sighted aims at what you're aiming at, right? So we're kind of going back to, the mindset of redemption, which, if we're talking about trying to achieve certain objectives, I mean, your objective may be a new pair of shoes, right? Or a new car, or just to, pay your electricity bill, right? And if these are your objectives, they are incredibly short-sighted. Although I'm not saying that they are not unfounded and they don't have their valid way of looking at things. But if you're only aiming at the now, then your future will never be secure because, again, you're just living day to day. You're not living for, you know, 10 years from now. And you're not conducting yourself as if 10 years from now would be important. And that's kind of what it's like to be in Egypt. You know, you're narrow-minded and you're really focused on the now. You know, you're focused on the, you know, you only live once kind of attitude. But when you get into the wilderness and you're delivered from this, you're delivered from your short-sightedness. You're delivered from constantly indulging that selfish part of yourself, which, let's face facts, if you are an addict of any kind, you know, whether it be drugs, alcohol, or even sex, or, you know, any multitude of things where you are fulfilling legitimate needs with illegitimate ways, then what you're going to do is it's just going to feed into a cycle that is going to become more and more demanding of that illegitimate way. Because in your mind, the only way to fulfill this legitimate need is through this illegitimate way. And so pornography is a great example of this. You know, it may just start with some, you know, nude pictures of the, you know, opposite or even same sex. And then it may go into, you know, the actual thing. And then it becomes more and more lewd because you are consistently feeding into this mindset of gratifying your natural urge with an illegitimate way. And ultimately it's harmful because you're going to inflate this need because, again, it's going to become more about comfort, and you're going to become, you know, you're going to get comfort in this thing. And so when you are in the wilderness, it is when this comfort is taken away from you. It's when it's an awakening. It's a realization, all right, a slow one, a very slow one. Remember, the Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years. And basically what that's saying is that entire generation had to die because they had Egypt so far ingrained into them that they could not hear what God was saying. And so the next generation had to be raised with God. Whereas this generation that was rescued, they were just consistently falling back into their own understanding, and they couldn't get it. And what that means for you is that your old ways must die. They will have to die. And it is painful because, again, these old ways, even though they kept you in a mentality of being locked in to a, you know, lack of a better term, sinful nature, you know, into a nature where you are consistently just focused on you and gratifying your needs. And there's a certain amount of comfort to that. But once you realize that there's more to life, a truly more rewarding way to go about through life, that part of you must die. And all of those ways that you actually comforted yourself are going to have to die. And that's painful. It hurts. It does not feel good. And there is a bit amount of you know, lamenting upon, you know, on the way. I mean, you are consistently, you know, belly aching about this process of being refined because it's painful. It hurts. But once you go through it, then you're able to finally make it, you know, to the promised land. But that doesn't mean things get any easier, okay? Because life is still coming at you. But because you were in the wilderness and because you redefined your principles, your ethics, your goals, your priorities, I mean, it's a complete redefinition of yourself. And because of that, you are able to weather that. That is when you're going from Egypt and you're going into the wilderness. That is your house that was built upon the sand collapsing. But the process of being in the wilderness to get to the promised land is a process of rebuilding the house, studying, finding out where the rock is, right? The foundation on which to build your life. It's locating where that is, okay? And then it's rebuilding your life upon that. And that may take you a long time. It took the Israelites 40 years and an entire generation had to die. But it was worth it, okay? Because again, the Israelites were able to bring God, okay, to everyone. And, again, that may not be a happy story for you because you may be, of a secular nature. But if it helps you to visualize it, just understand that they were able to bring the concept of good to everyone. I believe you can substitute those fairly well, and you can wrap your mind around it better. But I find it. Well, I'll leave it there. I don't want to preach to you too much, but yes, all of this is going to be biblically based, and I hope this serves to bring you closer to a life that includes people, that is less centered about you. Because when you do surround yourself with people that are like-minded, that are selfless, it's going to be a blessing to you. It really will. I can't begin to describe just how pleasurable it is to serve, because very few people will ever have received a gift and cry and say this was life-changing. But people can do that when they give and they change someone else's life for the better. That changes everybody. That touches everybody. And we may not have the best idea, about what good is, but we know what it's not, right? And then when we encounter true goodness, we can see it and we feel it. So that's what we're pursuing. So just to sum up, I would say that, again, Egypt, the wilderness, and the promised land. When you're in Egypt, you're closed-minded, right? You're focused on you. You are not trying to hear anything anyone else has to say, okay? And this is incredibly damaging to you, and it keeps you locked into a pattern focused on yourself. It's very bad. 2, when you're in the wilderness, you are in pain, but this pain will be used to refine you and rebuild your life upon a solid foundation that can weather the storms of life. Okay, but it is painful, and you must endure, and you must persevere. You must not run back to Egypt, because again, life will never get better in Egypt. It will always be there. And it's not to say life gets easier. It just becomes more fulfilling, right? That's where Christians get their joy from. Okay, it's from the Lord and serving Him, but in a more general secular way, if this helps you, is to say that the deep fulfillment of serving and surrounding yourself in the love of others is that's what it's all about. That's what it is. So keep focused on that, okay? So yeah, I think we'll leave it there. I'll probably do a video a little bit more about what Egypt looks like, what the wilderness looks like more. But this was just to kind of get you not antiquated, but acquainted with the concept of the journey of redemption. And so I think we'll leave it there. And I don't know. I'd love to know what you guys think. If you like the video, I would appreciate a like. If you want to see more, please click the subscribe button. And more importantly, if you could share what your road to redemption looks like. What does your Egypt look like, or what does your wilderness? You don't have to get into any specifics, but just know that somebody may be empowered, and actually may help them in the middle of their wilderness to hear what your story is. All right, well, I'm gonna leave it here, YouTube. Have a good one.